Fantastic. Well, welcome to Crabbing 101. We are super excited that you are here. My name is Kayla Clark, and I coordinate the public programs. So myself and Ipsita Tingy will be the moderators. So with that, I also want to mention that this program is going to be focused on how to go crabbing. So we hope you find it really useful. I do know that we have a number of younger folks on the call today as well. So I did want to mention that on July 16th, we are going to be doing a crab program for younger audiences for ages 4 to 8, which will include more games and crab costumes and that sort of thing. But today you're going to be getting to hear from Associate Extension Director Bryan Fluech, and you'll also be getting a chance to really see how to crab from beginning to end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bryan to get us started.
Thanks, Kayla. So welcome, everybody. As Kayla said, my name is Bryan Fluech. I'm down at our Brunswick office, and besides serving as our Associate Marine Extension Director, I am also our Fisheries Extension Agent. And part of my job is to work with our fishing communities and the general public about the importance of responsible fishing practices and making sure our industry still remains sustainable. So obviously today we're talking about crabbing. Just to let you know, throughout it, we've got some questions for you to keep you engaged. And I also have some videos. And then I've got a few live demos as well. So we'll be kind of going back and forth. In fact, I'm going to start off with a poll and for everybody. But, you know, the great thing about crabbing, it really is something that can be done by all ages. And it doesn't require a whole lot of equipment and time. And it's really just a great way to get outdoors and enjoy our natural resources. So we're going to put a question up for everybody just to give me a better understanding of who's listening to this about their crabbing experience. So if we can go ahead and put up the poll, and hopefully you'll be getting some, I want to get a better understanding of whether I'm talking to a bunch of pros or, hey, I've never gone, or yeah, I can hold my own. So if you can, just see what your crabbing experience is.
Ipsita's going to share the poll results so that you can see that, again, it's a mix of all over in terms of experience.
And I can always use the pro, so, you know, that's good to know. But yeah, did you get a mix? And that's helpful out here. And, you know, the one thing, and we can go ahead and change the slide, but the one thing that's helpful to know, I mean, everyone has some of their own unique ways of going, and some of the ways they like to rig the gear. So even the way I might explain something might be different from somebody else. So hopefully it'll be a broader overview. But you can see right here some of the things that I want to go through just to provide context, because it's one thing to actually say, hey, this is the gear, but it helps to know a little bit about the biology of the animals as well, and about the rules. So again, you might hear some of the information repeated more than once besides myself and the video. So we'll go ahead and switch over to the next slide. But so this is what we're here to talk about, our beautiful, our savory, beautiful swimmer. I'm going to grab our little friend here for a second. I'm going to bring him up here. But the focus, of course, are blue crab here. And blue crabs are amazing animals. The fact that really it's, I think for most people coming to the coast, this is one of those more animals that a lot of times is synonymous with it. But I actually have a live crab here to show. I figured that might be a little better. And he's already pinching my tray off. So we'll see. But that way people are going to actually see a live crab here. So he's waving to everybody. And what's pretty cool, that name, Callinectes sapidus, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on scientific names, but the fact that it does translate to that savory, beautiful swimmer. And there's a lot of culture associated with blue crabs that we can found really up from Nova Scotia all the way down the Atlantic seaboard, through the Gulf of Mexico, and down even into South America. But particularly for us in the Low Country in Georgia and South Carolina, blue crabs really are a staple, and not only from a commercial perspective, but from recreational too, which we're going to focus on. But you can see, especially, I've got a male here, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But that very characteristic blue color in its claws. Blue crabs and our shrimp and lobster are known as decapods. So deca meaning 10. So in all, we've got 10 pinnages here. Our 2 large pinchers, which they're going to use for not only defense, which if you've ever been pinched by one, you know that they mean business, but also for securing food. And you can tell, you can see that they've got those little modified teeth. And I say teeth, not like you and I have, but to help grip their prey and tear it up. But then you also have 3 pairs of walking legs, which in this case, you'll see that they're missing. And one of the characteristics of arthropods is they've got segmented bodies and can actually regenerate body parts. So unlike you and I that have internal skeletons, they have exoskeletons. So you can kind of hear me tapping on it. If they drop a leg, which sometimes they will do on purpose, they will actually be able to regenerate it. And that what we call molting is when they actually get a new carapace or shell is the other term. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but at least wanted to show a live version of a crab. We're going to meet some of his buddies later that did not have the same happy fate that he did when it talks to actually consuming it. So I'm going to put him back in his tank. And then we're going to go actually go back to the PowerPoint just to kind of move forward here. Oh. And just a little bit about basic identification purposes, because this is obviously what we're focusing on. It's not the only crab out here in Georgia. You can see that shell tends to have that, or carapace is the more technical term, kind of has that olive color. If you can go ahead and advance the slide, the animation here, I just want to point out some features, because what's nice is that we can tell the difference between male and female crab by several characteristics, especially underneath what we call the apron or the belly. You can see that on the right-hand side, it kind of breaks out between a male crab and as well as an immature and a mature female. So male is also referred to as Jimmy. You can see their abdomen is a little bit more skinny, elongated. We like to say that it's like the Washington Monument. A mature female, or a sook, we'll say it's the Capitol Dome, a little bit rounder. And then an immature female, which sometimes people will call a Sally or even a she crab, it's a triangle or looks like a pyramid. So those characteristics definitely are one of the easiest way of identifying it. But you can also see by the claws with the mature female, the tips of their claws will be red. Juvenile males, though, sometimes they'll have red as well. So it's especially with the mature females that you can definitely distinguish. And the males can be, will get larger than the females. So there have been crabs recorded of over 9 inches in other parts of their range. So, and we'll talk a little bit about size limits in a second, but I just wanted to point out some of the basic features. So the other part too, just know a little bit about how these crabs live their lives. And we're very fortunate here in coastal Georgia, where our estuaries are an important part of our economy and our cultures and our communities. But like a lot of our marine life, like our shrimp and a lot of our fish, they depend on our estuaries. So those coastal regions where fresh and saltwater mix to spin out their life cycles. And what's neat about this is they actually use different parts. So you can see up here at the top, you'll have, it says a mating adult. Usually mating occurs up in our lower salinities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But then the females, once they've got their eggs, they'll move down actually into the lower parts of our estuary out to the near shore coastal waters, where they'll release their fertilized eggs. And what you and I think of what a crab looks like, when they're born, they actually go through several planktonic stages. And so they actually almost look like little space creatures. And over a period of several weeks, they'll start transforming and metamorphosizing into what we eventually think of as a crab. And so this life pattern, once they start getting that word ingress, means they're starting to move up into the estuary. Those juveniles are going to utilize our oyster bars, our salt marsh, even some of the shell rubble, and even the mud habitats to make their way back up into the estuaries. So they actually depend on different parts. The males will actually even go up into freshwater, and they do need those lower salinities, where the females, they will prefer usually the higher salinities. But it is that connection where if we don't have good habitat, we're not going to have the crabs that we like to go catch. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about mating. And if you're lucky enough, sometimes you might actually pull up 2 crabs at the same time. And these are often referred to as doublers. And what's happening here, I mentioned earlier that these crabs have external skeletons, so an exoskeleton. Well, for them to mate, that female, she actually has to be soft. That shell has to, they can't mate if her shell's hardened. So usually up in the lower or upper part of our estuary, the males will actually start doing a little dance. And there's actually some cool videos online. You'll see them take those back paddles and spin them around. And they attract the female with different pheromones. And basically what happens is in a few days, what she'll do is molt her shell. But in the meantime, he's going to hold on to her and protect her. So usually in fact, I went crabbing with my son last night and we caught a doubler. And you could see that the male was basically cradling the female. And once she actually molts, he'll flip her over, and then that's where the mating occurs. And then from there, they'll go their separate ways. And the female, as I mentioned in the slide before, will move down into towards the lower parts of our estuary. What's pretty cool about that, though, is the sperm that she's carrying, she can actually hold for over a year. And eventually what's going to happen, those fertilized eggs, she's going to transfer them to the outside of her body. And what you see here on the right side, you see two female crabs, two sooks, with an orange mass and a black mass. These are called sponge crabs. And what you're looking at are egg masses. And that egg mass can have well over 1 million eggs. The difference in color, though, the orange is from the yolk sac inside the little embryo. And as it starts developing and uses up that yolk, they're going to start develop, that yolk disappears. And that's why you see that transition from a bright orange, kind of like a basketball, to that black color. And by that point, again, as I showed in the previous slide, they've moved on to the near shore areas. Well, they'll release those eggs. And what's interesting about females, they have what's called a terminal molt. So once they do that mating, they only do that one time, but she can actually have several masses of eggs. And crabs don't live a long time. It might only be 3-4 years. Some of them don't even last that long. So, and they can actually reach maturity within 1.5 years. A lot of that, just like us, depends on their diet, which could be comprised of both live and dead material. They're opportunistic, which means they're going to eat what they can get their claws on, which they are pretty quick. So if you've ever been pinched by one, you have to be careful. And we'll talk a little bit about that once we actually talk about the crabbing piece. And you'll see in this next slide, though, the other part I just want to mention about the molting, because sometimes you might be fortunate enough to get to see this. If you've ever had a soft shell crab, that's just a blue crab that has molted. There's actually a commercial industry for that here, along with crabbing for hard crabs. But because they don't have the endoskeleton, what will happen is that crab over a lifetime might molt 20, 25, 30 times. And the plankton part of their life cycle, they're going to be molting a lot more often, maybe every several days. As they get older, it slows down a little bit. But what's going to happen at the back of their carapace, they're basically going to split, open up, and they're going to basically start wiggling their way out of the old carapace, and they're going to pump themselves up with water. What's interesting, when the new crab emerges, it can be about 1/3 of the size bigger than it was from the previous molt. And in this stage, it's very soft and palatable. And that's where, especially if you like to eat soft-shelled crabs, there are the commercial fishermen, they keep them in tanks. And as soon as they molt, they pull them out, and that's when they'll go up to markets, restaurants to eat at. But sometimes, and fishermen who've been doing this for a while, and this is beyond what we're going to talk about today, but peeler is another term, and that's a juvenile female that shows signs of molting. And that's not only looking at maybe lines that develop on the back of that carapace, but particularly the colors on the back end of their paddles. So it can take a little bit of practice to identify a peeler. I just wanted to throw this in there to make people aware. And I think the next slide, we're actually just a little bit of a basic 101 biology review. We're going to show, this is about a 2.5-minute video clip with our colleague Dodie. Nope, got to go back.
Blue crabs belong to a large group of organisms known as arthropods. Arthropods are organisms that possess jointed appendages. When you look at the external features of the blue crab, you can see that it is adapted for living in an aquatic environment. The carapace is narrow and streamlined. It has 2 pinchers used for defense and capturing food items, 3 pairs of walking legs, and a pair of paddle-shaped rear swimming legs that make it a very efficient swimmer. You can distinguish male blue crabs from female blue crabs by looking at the shape of their abdomen or apron. Mature male blue crabs, or jimmies, have a strongly tapered apron that resembles an inverted T, whereas mature females, or sooks, have a broad rounded apron. Immature females, also known as she crabs or sallies, have a triangular shaped apron. Sponge crabs, or egg-bearing females, possess a mass of orange or black eggs on their underside and are illegal to keep. This image shows the movement of blue crabs throughout their life cycle. Females migrate to higher salinity waters to spawn. The eggs hatch into larvae referred to as zoea larvae and undergo a series of molts. Using the tides and currents, blue crab larvae move from deeper open ocean waters into shallow waters of the estuary, where they continue to molt. The estuary serves as an important nursery area for developing juvenile blue crabs. With a life expectancy of about 3 to 4 years, blue crabs will spend a large portion of their time in estuaries and sounds foraging on clams, oysters, mussels, and other organisms. They are an ecologically important species that serve both as predator of benthic communities and prey for many fish species, like red drum, croaker, striped bass, and other blue crabs. Economically, blue crabs are one of Georgia's most valuable commercial fisheries. Commercial landings in Georgia produce millions in dockside value every year. For more information, visit the Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant website.
We just wanted to give you a brief overview, and we'll talk about these videos because we have some others on some of the other aspects of crabbing, but just want to test your knowledge, make sure no one's already fallen asleep. But here we've got an image of 3 crabs, I want to know which crab is a mature female. Is it number 1, number 2, or number 3? And we're going to put up a poll again. We're going to see who's been paying attention. So
and if you have a computer and that poll is covering your image, you can actually move that poll box over to the side so that you can see those pictures. Sorry, Brian, to cut you off.
Oh, not at all. I'll give you a few more seconds. The nice thing about this, if you didn't get it right, it's a learning opportunity. All right. So it looks like most of us, we got some pros here. So most of you correctly answered that it's the second picture. In fact, Kayla, if you advance that slide, or just pull up the answers on the slide here, you'll see it's just as a reminder. The top one, I said Washington Monument. Dodie in the video mentioned inverted T. The correct answer is the Sook, that second answer with the Capitol Dome, and then our Sally, our immature female on the third picture. One thing I failed to mention though, in that we talked about sponge crabs, about their life cycle. Typically, this is a good time of the year. Really, we start seeing them in maybe late March, probably April, really throughout the summer. So, and we'll talk a little bit about moving forward with the regulations because it's very likely that you might encounter it. We'll go ahead and move to the next. So, of course, being a good steward is always an important part, whether we're fishing for finfish or shellfish, and crabs are no different. And part of that is understanding our rules and regulations here in Georgia. And of course, we're not going to necessarily be able to go through everything during this segment, but I do want to provide some basics. First off is the fact that you do need a fishing license if you're over 16, a resident or non-resident in Georgia. And particularly because this is saltwater, you also need what's known as a Saltwater Information Program permit, or SIP. That part is free, but it's a way for our fishery managers to keep track both at the state and federal level. And I've got information at the bottom, that link there to Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They are a state management agency. I believe CETA just put that link up on the chat box. So that's always important to check with your management agencies in case any rules change. And usually this is a way to protect population. So fortunately here in Georgia, you can crab year round, day or night. And there are restrictions about the traps that you use. And I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But also size limits and harvest limits. And I'm going to actually get back here and share my screen so that you can see all of me here. I'm going to bring my little buddy back. Doesn't seem too happy about that. You can see. And one thing I will say about holding a live crab, you want to be very careful. You never want to put your thumb up front because they can reach back. So if you'll notice, I am holding them back here by its back paddles. Be very careful about putting your thumb up there because they can reach, and they can also be very, very quick. But when it does come to size limits, there is a rule that the crab, if it's a male, has to be at least 5 inches across its carapace. And it's important to know how to measure, because when I say 5 inches, I'm talking about from this point all the way over to this point across. And this one actually has a little bit of a broken tip, but I've got a ruler here. And basically, if I measure him across from that point to point, he is well beyond the 5 inches that is required. So this was a crab that I had caught this morning. This one's actually 6 inches, but that is an important part, not only being able to identify whether it's mature or immature, but knowing how to properly measure is a key piece of that. The other thing is I mentioned harvest limits, and that's how many crabs can you keep in a single day. And a term that you often hear with crabs is called a bushel. And a bushel can be tricky because it's really based on the volume, and it really depends on the size of the crab that you have. But common piece of equipment that we have if you're on fishing, especially for crabs, is a 5-gallon bucket. So a bushel really, if you're getting, let's say you've got 5.5 to 7 inch jimmies, all male crabs, a bushel will be approximately a 5-gallon bucket and a half. So that's quite a lot of crabs to hold. Of course, the exact number of crabs might vary depending on the size, but general rule of thumb, a bushel would be about a 5-gallon bucket and a half. If you're crabbing from a boat, there's actually a 2-bushel limit. But again, this is where you need to double check with Department of Natural Resources and follow their rules for that. And then we'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation with that. So knowing the size limits, being able to identify whether it's a male or female. And this is particularly important because you heard even in the last video, keeping those sponge crabs is illegal. And think about it, that's going to be your future generations. And part of that is determined by the number of people that are actually fishing. And this is something that fishery managers have to consider. So just some of the basics in terms of knowing our regulations. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide where we have a video, I believe, to give you a nice little recap of what I just mentioned.
Blue crabs are vulnerable to pollution, habitat loss, and harvest pressure. Georgia's blue crab fishery is managed by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Coastal Resources Division. Catch and size limits are intended to keep crabbers from taking too many crabs.
Oh, there we go. Oh. We could go back. See, it looks like the video got cut off there. Sorry about that.
Blue crabs are vulnerable to pollution, habitat loss, and harvest pressure. Georgia's blue crab fishery is managed by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Coastal Resources Division. Catch and size limits are intended to keep crabbers from taking too many crabs at one time and protect crabs of spawning size. It is important for recreational crabbers to abide by blue crab fishing regulations in order to maintain a healthy and sustainable population. Residents and non-residents 16 years and older who crab recreationally in Georgia are required by law to obtain a fishing license, as well as a free saltwater information program, or SIP, permit. However, Georgia residents crabbing off their private property are not required to have a license. For complete details about Georgia fishing license requirements, visit the following website. Blue crab size limits dictate that the crab must measure at least 5 inches from spike to spike along its carapace. Blue crabs measuring less than 5 inches, other than peeler or a mature adult female, are illegal to harvest. Mature adult females, or sooks, can be identified by their apron, which is more rounded and resembles the Capitol dome. It is unlawful to harvest female crabs bearing eggs. These are commonly referred to as sponge crabs and can be easily identified by the orange or black mass of eggs on the underside of the carapace. Learn how to identify male and female blue crabs by watching our blue crab biology video. Licensed recreational crabbers may take no more than 1 bushel of crabs during a 24-hour period. 1.5 5-gallon buckets full of jimmy crabs that are approximately 5 to 7 inches in size is about the same as 1 bushel of blue crabs. No more than 2 bushels may be taken recreationally or possessed during a 24-hour period on a boat with more than 1 person on board. For more information, visit the Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant website.
So, as the video talked about, the males have to be the 5 inches across. They're for the mature females without eggs, because those are prohibited. There is not a size limit. That's where some people decide, hey, they still have to be, that's their personal preference. Keep in mind those mature females, those sooks, once they've reached that stage, it's thought that they've reached that terminal molt and will not be growing anymore. That is partly why there's not a size limit on mature females. But they also mentioned about peelers in the rule books. They talk about being 3 inches. But again, that goes back to being able to identify the signs of a peeler, which does take a little bit more in depth. So I know at the beginning when I asked about who was the pro, I think I saw 1 or 2 people, and it can be tough on that one. So I do have a question for you here. This was a crab that I caught last year, actually. And you can see I've got a measuring tape from point to point. And the question is, and it's a male crab, it said, would this male crab be legal to harvest based off what we just learned? So what do you know? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. This is a good group. All right. I'm quickly seeing everybody said absolutely, yeah, because this crab, as you can see from the point to point on the carapace, is a little over 8 inches. So that was a pretty good sized male crab, and I'm happy to say it was delicious. But yeah, that was definitely a legal sized crab to keep. So good job, everybody. Then I have another question for you in terms of which crabs would be legal to keep, just to keep you engaged here. So if we go to the next slide, we'll have some more pictures up here. And so it says, which of these crabs would be legal? So which one would you legally be allowed to take? So based off what we just learned about in the videos, which one would be legal to take? Again, we've got 2 crabs here. So A and C have masses underneath of them. B, if you can't see them, has kind of a wider capital dome shape. And D actually has a triangle shape, hard crab. All right, so it looks like the majority of the group, I got this correct, that the one that would be legal would be the sook, the mature female that does not have her eggs. The reason A and C, the ones with the masses, those are both sponge crabs. That the one with the orange, that's a freshly developed mass, whereas the black one, that's when they're the larvae are fully developed and being ready to be released. So either way, those would be legal. D, that is a hard, immature female crab. It's not usually a peeler. One of the signs is that triangle would be a little bit of a darker color. That's one way of doing it. But unless you had an immature female that was 5 inches, which not saying is impossible, but it's pretty close, that would also be an illegal crab to take. And I will say, even though I don't have a reference in that picture, that one was probably 2 inches wide, so pretty tiny little crab. But yeah, the one in females. Now, I will say, I know some of you might be calling from out of state or participating. Check with your rules, because obviously we're talking about Georgia here. In some states, there are rules about even harvesting the sooks, the mature females. So I do want to bring that up. But in Georgia, those are legal to harvest. All right, so let's just transition a little bit here. We'll go to the next slide. Talk actually a little bit about going crabbing. And I said this at the very beginning, that everyone has their different styles and how they go about doing this. But some of the basic things we're going to be talking about, if you have a crab pot versus a ring net, which we'll talk about. This happens to be my daughter from the other day, actually, and we went crabbing. This is probably one of the most common gears that you're going to see here. But we're going to talk about a little bit about the bait that people might use and some of the other things. So I'm going to, again, get back out here. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to talk a little bit about some common gear that we get out here. All right, so the first thing, probably one of the most common types of gear that you're going to see a lot of people using, what we call our ring nets. I've got 2 varieties here. I actually have one that is cloth. I have one that's metal. Okay, now this is people's preference on using this. Some people like to say, hey, after a while, I've been using the ones with the nets. They get that nice little stench to it. That's some people's preference, saying, hey, the crabs will do that or be attracted to those better. I don't know if I would agree with that necessarily from a scientific point of view, but everybody when it comes to fishing definitely has their different styles. But when it comes to these ring nets, though, there's two rings. There's an inner ring and there's an outer ring. And the bottom part here, we have a weight. And this is what's neat about crabbing, because you can buy these at the store. The prices might range from $10 to $15 depending on whether or not they already have a weight or not. This happens to be about a 3-ounce weight on here. If you're not from here or not familiar with our tides, we can have pretty ripping tides at times, anywhere from 6 to 8 foot difference twice a day here in coastal Georgia. Sometimes maybe on a full moon or a new moon, you might need more weights. I've seen people use bricks. I've seen them attach pantyhose with rocks in it. So you might have to adjust the amount of weight. But what that's going to do, particularly where you're crabbing from, it's going to allow that net to get down to the bottom. And of course, what happens when you're going to tie your bait. So you also have a piece of string here. Usually chicken. Chicken's a very common bait that people use. But as someone who fishes, once I've cleaned my fish, I've got a fish carcass, I will tie that in. A lot of times that fresh bait is a good means. Some people swear by, it needs to be nice and stinky. That's also part of your tolerance. And again, that's people's different preferences. But chicken necks, chicken backs tend to work well. And chicken necks are very cheap. So you can pretty affordable. You don't need to put the entire package. So I've seen people that think, more's better. Not necessarily. And again, when crabs, they're opportunistic. You're not necessarily, when the crab crawls onto the net, you're not necessarily going to feel that. And this is also, if you've got younger kids, where patience comes in, because, I know when my kids are younger, they want to pull it up every 10 seconds. That might not be as effective. I just kind of a general rule of thumb, I'll do 3 to 5 minutes, depending on how active the crabs are. Again, that's really your preference. But ring nets are not the only tool that people have. Honestly, just a line with a chicken bone. That's kind of how I originally was taught to crab when we used to go on vacations. And basically somewhere like on a boat ramp, you would slowly start pulling in that string because the crab's going to be holding on to that bait. And then you would use some type of dip net to pull them up. Some people will go waiting for crabs. If it's a low tide and you've got areas where you've got puddles, sometimes those crabs will sit in those puddles and you just go and scoop them up. I know people that are talented enough to do it by hand, but that's something that's going to be up to your comfort level. But the most common way, though, of course, is the actual drop nets. There's different configurations of there's box traps and pyramid traps. It's the same concept that you would lower it down from, let's say, a dock. And once it lays on the bottom, it lays out flat. There's bait tied in the middle, and you pull it up. So places, any of your tackle shops, any of your big sporting stores, they will, especially around here in Georgia, they are going to have crabbing gear. But yeah, at the very basic level, even something like a string with a chicken bone on it can certainly be used. The other one, though, that if you've got an actual, have the ability to have crab pots. Now, this is like a commercial crab pot or crab trap. You could also at stores buy smaller versions of this. Just a couple of things as a side note, because we talked about regulations. There are specific dimensions that are required by the state. So this is a trap that's geared to specifics. But if you're not familiar with the crab pot, there's basically 2 chambers here. You can actually see, and I will tell you real quick, this orange thing, this is what's known as a terrapin or a turtle excluder device. They are not required by law in Georgia, unlike some other states. But what this does, terrapins, which is actually a turtle species that we get in our estuaries, have been known to get in crab traps at a certain time. What these do actually allow the crabs to still get into the net or into the trap and excludes the terrapins. So much like what our shrimpers have to do with sea turtles. You can actually do it horizontal or vertical, and there's been past studies looking at the efficacy of that. But in this case, this trap has 2 throats or 2 entrances. So I've got one on this side, and I've got one on the other side. Some traps will have 4 in between, or in the bottom here. And you'll notice, I mentioned the tides. This is rebar, something to weight it down, because if you don't, it's easy for those strong currents to actually move the traps. So something to hold it down, and we've just zip tied the trap to the rebar. But our bait well, it's a little string there, and this is where I put the chicken or my fish carcass in there. I just have a label on this particular one. You always want to make sure that you close that little trap, otherwise that bait will fall out. And then the basic premise of these traps, you can see in the screen, there's 2 chambers. So the crab's going to actually crawl. They're going to be attracted by the scent of the bait. They're going to crawl into the throat here. And when crabs actually get spooked or scared, they'll have a tendency of swimming up. So what's going to happen is they will swim up into this upper chamber. And I know it's a little bit hard to tell here, but there is an opening where they can actually swim back up, and they'll stay up to the top part. The other piece of these traps, which is required by law, you've got obviously your line, and you have to have a buoy. For recreational crabbers, if they're freestanding traps, they actually have to be painted green, and believe you have to have your identification information on it. A lot of people will use these just off their dock, and they won't necessarily have the buoy. You're allowed up to 6 traps, but if they are freestanding out in the water, you make sure they're obviously not in main navigation ways, and also just being mindful of how much line you put on. But to get your crabs out, in this case, I basically just have a little bungee cord, and what that does is it allows the meat to open up, and you essentially you would take your crab and you would shake this out until the crabs fall into a bucket. The other piece of equipment, whether you have a crab pot or you're using the ring nets, are tongs. If you're not comfortable holding the crabs themselves, this is a great way to actually grab them and immobilize them until you can turn them around in the right way. So once you get your crabs, though, the one thing I do want to be mindful, because you think about in Georgia in the summer, it's hot. So, a lot of times people will crab for, several hours. The one thing you don't want to do is immerse them in water, because they will quickly use up the oxygen. So this is something where we do try, if you put them on ice, make sure they're on the ice and that they're not sinking below. Usually just even keeping some shade on them will cool them down. But the last thing, you don't want to let them sit in the water, because you want your crabs live as long as possible for that. And we're going to go back to the presentation. And actually, we've got a quick little video that just gives a little recap of what I talked about, some of the basics here. Oh, real quick there, where I can go, what's nice about this, we have so many access points here in Georgia. So anywhere you've got public access, like your piers, your docks, boat ramps, as long as there's not signage saying that you can't crab here. Certain bridges will also have, no crabbing or no fishing. But we do have a series of coastal fishing maps that are available per each of our counties. And I think they're going to, Kayla and Cedar are going to provide a link to accessing these. But what's nice is that for like Glenn County, for instance, when you open this up, it'll have a map and it'll show you where some certain points are. But really, even on shorelines, that's the great thing about it. Some people say, well, should I do it on an incoming tide, outgoing? That's really your preference. I mean, I will say from experience, just making sure that tide's moving, because when the tide slacks, there can be a little bit of a lull. And I will say sometimes it's like it's hot catching and then nothing. So, environmental conditions are certainly going to influence how active. Typically in the summer, late spring through fall is really when the crabbing is best here. Winter, it's going to slow down. The crabs aren't going to be moving as much. So, particularly this time of year, being in June, this is a great time to go crabbing, and all summer. So it's a great activity. And I think the next slide is the video that we were going to show. And this just kind of gives you a little bit more a recap.
Coastal Georgia is a popular site for recreational crabbing. It's allowed year-round at any time of the day, and there are a number of ways for licensed crabbers to harvest blue crabs. Blue crab traps or pots can be used by licensed recreational crabbers. They can be purchased at local hardware and marine supply stores. Crabbers may use up to 6 standard-sized crab traps that are no larger than 2 by 2 feet. Crab traps must have 2 escape rings on the outside vertical wall that allow juvenile blue crabs and small fish to escape. Diamondback terrapin excluder devices can easily fit on the outer entrance funnels on crab traps. These excluder devices prevent terrapins from getting caught in the traps and drowning. Coastal organizations like Tybee Island Marine Science Center provide terrapin excluder devices to the public for free. A metal frame can be attached to the crab trap to help weigh down the trap and prevent loss in strong tidal currents. Raw chicken or fish parts are commonly used as bait, which is placed in the bait box in the center of the trap. Recreational crabbers are required to mark their trap with a fluorescent green buoy with the owner's name and address in 1-inch letters. More popular and widely used recreational crabbing gear may include crab ring nets and hand lines. Ring nets can be purchased at local hardware and marine supply stores. Ring nets and hand lines are reasonably priced and easy to use. Most often, they're used at docks, bridges, and local marinas. Weights can be added to the crab rings and hand lines to weigh the gear down in strong currents. Chicken parts are attached to the net or hand line, and the gear is lowered into the water. It is helpful to tie the other end of the line to the dock to prevent loss of the net. The crab ring or hand line is then periodically checked for blue crabs. For more information, visit the Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant website.
I know my mom's probably out there with her ear raised, and I'd be remiss if I did not say, obviously, if you're handling raw chicken parts or fish, please wash your hands, because I know I had to make sure I get that in there. I failed to mention the crab rings, the escape rings on the crab pots. So this trap does have them, but as Dodie explained in that video, it's a means of allowing small juveniles. The other thing too, before we just talk the last part here about actually enjoying your catch, I mentioned about stewardship and your regulations. The other piece of that too is a lot of times with chicken, people, there's the container that comes in. Just be mindful of when you are crabbing, and if you've got the containers or bags or anything like that, making sure that you're being a good steward and actually picking those up. Unfortunately, sometimes you go to locations where there's been a lot of activity and you can see signs of where people have left stuff. So that's something too, regardless if you're in Georgia or any other state doing this, doing your part to keep our environment as clean and looking good. All right, my favorite part, of course, and why I love to crab so much is enjoying your catch and being able to eat it. And I was going to ask Kayla for people, what's your favorite way of eating crab? And I think you can just enter your answers into the chat box. Is there a particular dish? I'm always learning new ways of preparing it. The great thing about crab, just something as basic as just boiling it. And now, of course, if you're from the mid-Atlantic states, steaming it, but down here, people like to boil their crab. But it's really versatile. I mean, this is a great way to gather with friends and family and just pick crab. But of course, you can do different dishes from different pastas and making dips. Crab cakes is another favorite way. There's a lot of recipes out there, and we're going to share one sheet that our friends with UGA Cooperative Extension helped us put together. But I've got some crabs, and we'll go to the next slide real quick. I just boiled some crabs this morning, and we're going to get out of the PowerPoint here in a second. And I'm going to pick a crab for you, which again, everybody has some different means of doing it. But if you've never done it before, it might be intimidating the first time. I did just want to make you aware of the different types of meat. And this applies both if you're picking it just to be familiar, but also if you go and buy crab, canned crab. There are different grades or different sizes. Probably for most people, the ones they love the most are the jumbo lump. And you can see in this slide, it's the muscles that attach to those back swimming legs. Those tend to be the biggest chunks. Lump crabs, the next size down, this is going to be the body meat. And as you'll see here in a second, as I start to pick the crab, you'll see the different segments. And the segments are really where the muscles attach to those walking legs. And then the special meat, same thing. It's also part of that body meat in those different segments, but it might just be the smaller piece. And then typically the one that's at least in stores, that might be the least expensive is the claw meat. This is my favorite meat. It tends to be a little bit more brown in color, has a little bit more a stronger flavor. The legs, the claw, the meat in the legs and the claws, to me, I think are the best part about crabs. But everybody each has their own. And then real quick, if we go to the next slide, I believe this is our recipes which we're also going to share with you. So you don't have to copy, you can read that. You don't have to worry about copying it down. But what this is, again, I mentioned our seafood specialist and our partner with Jackie Ogden with UGA Cooperative Extension up in the Savannah area helped us put these recipes together, getting feedback from some of our local restaurants. But there's a recipe in here from just boiling crabs to doing a dip, casserole. So really, it's kind of limitless in how you can prepare them and your comfort level. And everybody likes to eat different ways. But what I'm going to do here is get back here and share my screen. Let's see here.
And Bryan, I don't know if you can hear me, but we did have a question from the audience about preparing.
Okay, perfect.
We had a question about whether or not you need to clean out the crab before boiling, if you need to actually take the guts out or not.
Yeah, so you'll see in this case, these are some recently boiled crabs, and I actually normally do what we call backing, where you clean them out first. That's because we usually use are making crab cakes. Some people will swear up and down like, nope, you cook the whole thing. It's a personal preference for me because, as you'll see here in a second, the organs and also what we call the mustard, which is really the hepatopancreas. That's where it'll basically it's liver. It acts like that. So if you're concerned about potential pollutants and stuff, that's where cleaning the crab first, you can. But the fact that you're not actually eating the organs, and I'll kind of point that out in a second. So some of that's personal preference. Again, normally my wife and I do back the crab before we cook it or before I boil it. Some people would probably say, no, that takes out the flavor. So that's your preference. But a lot of times when you go online and look at recipes, they're throwing the whole crab in there. So really, really good question. And sometimes that's down to personal preference. So I know we got about 10 more minutes. It's perfect timing here. One thing I want to say with the boiling, just from a safety factor, of course, but what happens when I get back home with these crabs, I try to cook them really the next day or day after. It's something that's, it's better fresh. What I do is I will put the crabs in the fridge, and it basically stuns them. It keeps them cold. I know some people might put them right to boiling, but just for me handling them, you do want to make sure the crabs are alive. And obviously these are cooked and are not anymore. But even when they're slow and kind of in that, they're stunned, you will still see some slight movement. So you can definitely tell. And, if you pick up a dead crab, it's basically just going to kind of lay limp. But you wait till the water's boiling. That's another piece. As far as the type of seasoning, that's really up to you. I know some people say, use lots of salt and garlic. Some people say, nope, just use plain water. Again, that's your preference. But the one thing I would say is wait till the water's boiling. You're going to put the whole crabs in there. Just be careful about not dropping them in there because of splashing. But then for about 15 minutes or so, you may get up to 20 minutes. But what's nice is some of the crabs will eventually start floating to the top. That red color you see, by the way, if you didn't know, the reason crabs and shrimp and lobster turn red, they've got pigments in their shells that normally are really tightly bound with proteins. And so the orange reddish color doesn't show. That's why they have more of a brown olive color. However, once you start cooking them, the heat is going to denature the proteins that bound to those pigments, and the colors are going to come out. Okay, so that's actually why you get that orange. And it's the same pigments that you get in vegetables. So it's a type of carotenoid if you're familiar with pigments. So cool, interesting fact. So what I'm going to do here, I think everybody can see my crab here, and I've got I've got 4 or 5 here. We're going to kind of do step by step. But the first thing I'm going to want to do, I always bring a little pair of, nutcracker, a knife out here. So, make sure if your child, make sure you get permission. Have some type of spoon or fork, and I'll show you that in a second. First thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to take off the carapace. And this time it kind of did not come off in one piece. There you go. So nice and yucky right before lunch or during your lunch. A lot of the organs come out with it. One of the first things you want to do, I just had a claw drop off, the gills. These are also called dead man's fingers. These are not edible, so you definitely want to scrape these off. And this is where some people like to use a knife, so it's really your preference, but just for the sake of time. Scraping off the dead man's fingers. If you've got a lot, sometimes the guts and stuff, I'll use a spoon to just kind of scrape those out, and it'll be a little soupy. The other thing too is the front part of the crab. You'll just kind of, like, call the face, you'll break those off as well. So making sure you've got all those loose. And one other thing here that I find when you flip it over, this was a Jimmy, of course, I go ahead and basically take the apron off, and that's going to allow a little bit, make it easier for this next step. All I'm doing is I'm holding, I'm just going to fold it in, and I'm going to break it in half. So now I've got two body parts. I'm going to go ahead, and again, some people do this in a different order. I'm going to go ahead and just break the legs. This is what some people call the knuckles, where the joints meet the body. I'm just going to go ahead and break these off. And this is for picking crab. And even right now, you can see the one little leg piece, part of the meat. This is going to be my lunch today, by the way, guys. So I'll get to the legs here in a second. So what I've got now is half the body. And this is where that knife comes in. So, right, just to give you orientation, this back part, this is where those that back fin was, the flippers. All I'm going to do here is just cut. What I do is basically kind of cut this in half. And when it does, it basically allows me to access the meat. And I talked about jumbo lump meat. And so this back piece here, the biggest chunk that comes out, get a nice big lump of meat from the back of the claws. Or I'm sorry, not the back of the paddles. Okay, so I scoop that out, and that's where your knife can come into to get the rest of it. But then inside I talked about each segment of the legs, which you can see there's part of one knuckle, there's another. There are these little compartments, and this is what's great about a knife, because that knife can actually help you pull out the different little segments of meat. And in this case, I talked about special meat. This is some of those body segments. It's flaky. And all I'm doing is I'm scooping out the various pieces. The meat yield of a blue crab is not entirely high, especially, for our sakes, we're talking about recreation. It might not even be 10%. I know there's been research done, like mechanically harvesting to try to maximize it. But really, and this is why your average consumer, at least 3 to 4 good-sized crabs. I can eat a lot more than that, but might be a snack. But same thing, this other part that I took off, all I'm doing is just breaking off the flakes that come out here. And what's nice about this crab meat, it's pretty flexible. So you can just kind of break off chunks. So you get these nice little segments in there. And that's where they were talking about the lump meat in the little segments in between the legs. So basically you would pick all that meat out and just kind of pick and go for the body segment. Then there's the actual legs, which I know some people like to leave this off. But what I do is I just kind of break off this top part there. I just squeeze. And when we squeeze it there, you've got a nice little segment of meat. And then, of course, there's the claws, which is also a popular piece. All I do is this is where that nutcracker comes in. I'm just giving it a nice little crack here. And the nice thing about claws sometimes, depending on, let's see, you can actually pull the claw out almost like a little cocktail. You get this nice little chunk of meat. And there's a little tendon in between there. I'll show this here. You can see that. So you always have to be mindful. I know I've heard some people say, I use that to clean my teeth. But nice little chunk of meat. And that is where I mentioned earlier about the browner color, a little bit more flavorful. And then the same thing with the different segments. Basically, all you're doing here is breaking the other pieces apart. You've got a nice little chunk of meat on the back part of the claw too. So I just wanted a real quick and dirty version of that. And there's lots of videos out on the market for you to show, and different people do it. In fact, if we go back to the PowerPoint presentation, because I know we're almost out of time, the videos that we've been showing you, we have a fourth video. Janelle Gibson, who is one of our employees, a wonderful woman, we've got her on video picking crab, and I've got nothing on Janelle, which is a great little video that just shows some basics. She grew up around the Pinpoint area and worked at the center there when it was still an active crab house. So just a lot of wonderful stories, but just an amazing woman in general. But she talks about how she picks crab. And, don't let if you don't get every bit of meat, don't worry about that. I'm certainly not an expert either. But at least it's a way of showing you some means of getting crab. And of course, if you're not good at it, you can always go to the restaurant and where they serve it. So last thing I want to talk about these videos, as I mentioned, all four of we didn't show the crab picking one, but these are all available online. We've got the link here. This is the same webpage where those coastal fishing maps are. And then the other thing that I'm going to show you on this page, or if you go on that website, if you go to the next page, or next slide, excuse me. We're going to skip the video just for timing, but then we'll, like I said, a chance for you to watch. The other thing that we, a couple years ago, we did a project where we got input from crabbers, and a lot of people just had a hard time by doing basic identification. So we have these little reference guides, and you can download this online. I just use a carabiner. There's even a little hole punch that you can punch out just to have with you when you go crabbing. But it has the ruler on there, just talks about with the identification of a male versus a female, what a bushel is, some of the basics of crabbing here in Georgia. And then, of course, it also has information about reaching out or to referencing Department of Natural Resources, since they are the actual management agency, but kind of a cheat sheet for crabbers. So we wanted to make you aware of that. And again, you can get it at the link that Kayla and Cita provided. So I think we've got a few minutes left to see if we have some questions. And I'm going to go ahead and widen my screen just in case anybody had. And, crabbing to me is really a trial and error thing. There's always an opportunity to learn every time you're out because the environmental conditions are different. But hopefully you've picked up a few tips here. And I'm certainly willing to, my contact information is online at our website. And Kayla, and we've got a lot of great educators up at our aquarium. So if you want to know more about getting into the activity, really encourage it because it's a great way to be outdoors and to learn about our environment. So guys, I just want to thank you for your time with that. And Kayla, let's see if we do have any questions. Otherwise, I just want to wish everybody good luck.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bryan. And we do have some questions. If you had fun, I hope you join us for future weeks. Every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, we'll be doing programs every Thursday at 2 o'clock. We have one more Friday program in July as well. So thank you for joining us. And if you do have a few minutes to stick around, we did have some questions that I can throw to Bryan as well, if that's okay with you, Bryan.
Yeah, please.
Awesome. So one question, so someone was curious, you mentioned that fish will eat crabs and other crabs will eat crabs. How do they do that when these crabs are hard and have claws?
Awesome question. So especially like species like black drum and red drum, who crabs are part of the diet, they actually have specialized teeth inside their mouth that's used for actually aiding them in crushing up those shells. So for the species that are adapted to it, yeah, they've got the hardware to match the shells of a crab. So fantastic question. And even things like squid that might be able to get a hold of a small juvenile crab, they've got very powerful beaks. And so, yeah, the animals that are eating the crab, they've got their own suite of tools to take care of that. So great question.
That is so cool to hear about those adaptations. There was a question about the males on the map when you'd shown that the males preferred that fresher water or lower salinity in the estuary. Do you know why that is or what factors influence that?
I don't specifically know if there's something with the chemistry aspect on that. And I would imagine for the females, one of the higher salinities, part of that too is when they're releasing their eggs, you got to consider buoyancy with that because you don't want to be setting up too high in the water column or too low. So that could be partly for the females, at least on the higher salinities. But I would imagine for the males, because they've been known to go into, almost fresh water completely. So I would imagine that's part of just something biochemical that's impacting.
Okay, cool. And kind of along the same lines, someone was curious about how long those females will carry that sponge mass around for.
So yeah, and it can. So after they leave the male, they retain that sperm, like I said, up to a year or so. But those masses can actually, it might take several weeks to form. And I didn't mention this, but if you ever clean a sook, it's not uncommon to see those eggs. You'll see a bright orange mass, which that also is what people use for she crab soup. So yeah, it's. I would say once they start developing that mass, it takes several weeks for them to going from that orange mass to darkening to black. So yeah, it could be several weeks that they're holding on to it. And then what they'll do in that summer. So let's just say in that they made it in the wintertime, and that summer she could potentially actually have more than one mess, 2 or 3 messes.
Awesome. We did have a question about safety for preparing crabs if you are going to eat them after you've been crabbing.
Sure.
Do people need to worry about salmonella or any other diseases that you might with other kinds of food?
I'm not familiar with the salmonella aspect. I don't think that's a concern. But the one thing I would say is cross-contamination. So just, if let's say you're going to be making, even here today, I mean, I had to make sure I cleaned my surface off because I've got crab juice dropping in there. And then, even if you have a cut, these crabs have been in water, and we overall have pretty good water quality here in Georgia. But you always have to be mindful if you've got cuts in yourself. And the other part of it too is just physically, these crabs don't mess around. So even when I've had many crabs, I always call it the crab revenge. When you're cooking them, you can get poked even when they're not trying to pinch you. So really the scrapes pieces are really, I think, more of a concern. We do also in Glenn County, we do have advisories for certain bodies of water. And we didn't go into that specifically, but again, DNR's website, the Environmental Protection Division as well, will have information about those advisories. And especially if you're nursing or pregnant or small children, that hepatopancreas I mentioned, the mustard that some people like, that's where your pollutants can filter, can accumulate. So that is something, depending on where you live, you should be mindful of that. I know a lot of traditionalists will say, oh, but that's what gives it flavor. Maybe it's the biologist in me, but that's why I partially like to clean my crabs. Maybe I'll sacrifice a little bit of flavor, just knowing that I'm not eating its, filtering parts of its body. So, but yeah, so I would say those are more concerns, not necessarily like on the salmonella or any type of other major food, parasites or anything like that. Crabs can get parasites, but it's not something that's maybe as prevalent as what you'd see in other species. But really just cross-contamination, making sure that you're aware of the bodies of water that you're crabbing in. And then, you are thoroughly cooking the crabs, which again, that's the nice thing about boiling for 15, 20 minutes. You're going to take care of that.
Well, thank you so much, Bryan, for all of this advice and information. And I'm so excited that in the chat box, some folks have said that they're going to go ahead and give crabbing a shot. That's awesome. That's exactly what we wanted out of this program. And if you have more questions, again, all of our contact information is up on our website, and that's gacoast.uga.edu. It is after 1:00, so we're going to go ahead and sign off, but we hope to see you again next week, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Happy crabbing.